Thank you very much, Sean. Anything is possible. It always seems impossible until it is done. Madiba taught us. So even, when they write your obituary and they say RIP, you must know that it also means RIP doesn't only mean rest in peace. It also means resurrection is possible. Let me start off by acknowledging government representatives of regional and international organizations, members of civil society and NGOs, the panelists who were here, academics, distinguished participants, and dear delegates to this Africa Policy Week. Allow us to offer full respect and acknowledgement of the many organizations contributing to this event, as well as their staff and volunteers who dedicate themselves tirelessly to the countless people who suffer unnecessarily. May we also offer full respect and acknowledgement to the lives we have lost and to the survivors who contribute to the essential work that is carried out at these gatherings and who create systems of support to not only those in need, but also the development of scientific research and the trajectory towards positive and meaningful change for all people. It is an honor and privilege to be invited to participate at this 2023 Africa Policy Week with representatives from Southern, Eastern, and West Africa and around the world as we place a much needed focus on our beloved continent of Africa. As a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, I share the commitment of the 29 members working to inspire better drug policy globally, moving away from prohibition and advocating for policies based on scientific evidence, human rights, public health, and security to effectively leave no one behind. I arrived back in South Africa yesterday from Mauritius, where the second meeting of the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs was held with fellow commissioners in collaboration with the government of Mauritius. What was discussed at this meeting has deep resonance with the issues to be discussed at this Africa Policy Week. The two-day gathering in Mauritius included experts from civil society, academia, multilateral agencies, as well as regional government officials with the purpose of focusing on current approaches to drug policy in our regions that do not seem to be working. At this meeting, we listened to the participants as they considered new ways of approaching drugs and drug policy, and certainly the action and appreciation of listening and being influenced. I think is an important first step. The act of listening is a very important first step so that we hear from those who are marginalized from merely doing drugs. But please forgive me if I'm preaching to the choir. I know many of you in this room here today are experts in these matters, and this knowledge has been true for you for a long time. However, it is because of the knowledge and voices of people like you that my fellow commissioners and I are able to listen and learn from you. It is commendable that the theme for the 2023 Africa Policy Week is putting people first, building on the statement issued by the United Nations Human Rights Commission calling for an end to stigma and discrimination and to put people first. You've already heard that the late Kofi Annan, who together with President Olusegun Obasanjo established the West Africa Commission on Drugs, said, and I quote, that drugs have destroyed many lives, but wrong government policies have destroyed many more, close quote. And so when approaching the topics of drug policy in Africa, it must also be remembered that we should consider avoiding blanket approaches which by their nature rely on assumptions and fail to acknowledge why insight into particularity and uniqueness is a key to delivering a more equitable, inclusive, and sustainable outcome. We all know that out of all the countries that make up our continent, it is hard to find two that are exactly the same. However, in 2011, Martin Meredith stated that, and I quote, although Africa is a continent of great diversity, African states have much in common, not only their origins as colonial territories, but the similar hazards and difficulties they have faced. Indeed, what is so striking about the 50-year period since independence is the extent to which African states have suffered so many of the same misfortunes, close quote. Allow me to reiterate in part some of the points I made at the UN World Health Organization side event at the 29th Harm Reduction International Conference held earlier this year in Melbourne, Australia. The World Health Organization's 2011 publication entitled Ensuring Balance in National Policies on Controlled Substances, Guidance for Availability and Accessibility of Controlled Medicines is laid on the table to be discussed, deliberated upon, and dissected as the World Health Organization itself seeks to revise this guide for global and national policies. The 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances, combined with the 1988 UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, not only control international trade in the substances, but also impose requirements concerning the drug laws that countries must apply domestically, thus locking into place a rigid system of drug prohibition and control, including in Africa. As a consequence, the international drug control system contains a deep-lying imbalance that favors punitive approaches over ensuring access to controlled medicines, despite the fact that the 1961 Single Convention has the key objective of ensuring access to and safe use of essential medicines, while limiting exclusively to medical and scientific purposes the production, manufacture, export, import, distribution of, trade in, use and possession of drugs, close quote. The impact of the 1961 Single Convention would become clear if we take a pain inventory of the world by stepping into the recent past and using the data available. The Lancet Commission on Palliative Care and Pain Relief, published in 2018, found that about 25.5 million out of 56.2 million people who died in 2015 experienced serious health-related suffering, and another 35.5 million experienced serious health-related suffering due to life-threatening and life-limiting conditions. A disproportionate number, more than 80% of these 61 million individuals, live in low-income and middle-income countries, of which Africa makes up a large proportion, with severely limited access to any palliative care, even oral morphine for pain relief. The report reads, and it continues, of the 298 million metric tons of morphine equivalent opioids distributed in the world each year, only 0.1 metric tons are distributed to low-income countries, and 50% of the global population, that is about 3.6 billion people who reside in the poorest countries, receive less than 1% of the morphine distributed worldwide, close quote. But as the pain inventory is attended to, filled out and ticked in wealthier countries, let us also recognize the other side of that coin of privilege and acknowledge the suffering of the opioid crisis in the United States of America, and how this unfortunate side of the coin has caused global alarm and perhaps in some countries, such as countries in our continent, added a layer of misinformation, anxiety, and excessively cautious knee-jerk reaction to morphine treatment. And in a region such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where many, many people who live in poverty die in agony as a result of AIDS-related conditions, of which a large portion are youth, a restrained and overcautious reaction to an opioid crisis across the Atlantic can result in the most poor and vulnerable, including children, not receiving palliative care due to misguided fear and lack of education and training on how to prescribe and administer morphine treatment. For instance, in South Africa, another factor that limits access to morphine is the fact that most nurses do not have the level of qualifications to prescribe it in a country where many urban and rural clinics are without a resident medical doctor and are run by the nurses, and where nursing sisters are the skilled practitioners who take care of patients in hospices. Compounded on top of this complex situation, there is also the concern about the level of education and pain management that healthcare workers are receiving in South Africa. Therefore, a solution to this is education, education, education. And access to palliative care for people living in poverty. And it is this access to vital information that guides health practitioners to recognize causes of pain in order to treat and manage it. However, Program Director, if exposure to vital information is a major determinant to the access of palliative care for the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, then the striking question that arises is, why did the World Health Organization withdraw and discontinue the 2011 guidance ensuring balance in national policies on controlled substances, guidance for availability and accessibility of controlled medicines, as well as the 2012 UN World Health Organization guidelines on the pharmacological treatment of persisting pain in children with medical illnesses. As if it was not enough to have existing layers of restricted access to the essential treatment, the World Health Organization's withdrawal of vital information seemingly exacerbated the problem by discontinuing the availability of guidelines that healthcare workers rely on to know what was safe and necessary for pain relief. Was the UN World Health Organization action taken to discontinue the 2011-2012 guidelines based on scientific evidence? I would like to assert that such actions have the potential to cause more harm to children in developing countries who may be left abandoned in their hour of agony to die in extreme pain. Professor Felicia Knoll of the University of Miami, chair of the Lancet Commission on Palliative Care, was quoted commenting, and I quote, "I believe that policies that work to deny access to necessary pain relief medication in low and middle income countries because of the situation in the United States of America are akin to denying food to people suffering from malnutrition because there is an obesity epidemic in the United States of America," close quote. So with the theme of this policy conference in mind, that is putting people first, another question arises that within the development of policy for Africa, we must ask how denying access to necessary pain relief in Africa because of the situation in the United States of America puts people first, and which people the UN intends to place at the head of the queue. The Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs believes that drug policies must be grounded in a public health approach based on scientific evidence and respect for human rights, and always putting people first. Drug prohibition has failed to achieve its goals of a drug-free world while having detrimental impact on our societies. It is causing far more harm than good. The past decade has seen impressive drug policy reforms at national and subnational levels around the world. More and more countries are adopting innovative approaches based on public health. Drug policies based on decriminalization and legalization are being pursued in a growing number of countries and being considered in many more. Our Commission seeks to promote the adoption of national legal frameworks and practices in line with human rights standards. This involves putting people's health and safety at the center, an approach that must overcome political barriers and be supported by adequate investment in evidence-based policy and practice. We believe also that governments of our region should consider a variety of reform in drug policy approaches, including decriminalization and legalization. Further, we feel that science can and should play a role not only in strengthening health and human rights approaches to drugs, but also in helping communities to achieve social justice. This means we must replace our existing harsh measures based on repressive ideologies with more humane and effective policies. These must be informed by scientific evidence, public health principles, and human rights standards. What we mean here is this. We must stop the practice of arresting people just because they use drugs, or might have a small amount of drugs on them for personal use. We must stop prosecuting and imprisoning people who use drugs. Alongside the war on drugs, the war on people who use drugs must also end. Since its inception in 2011, the Global Commission on Drug Policy advocates for 5 pathways of drug policy reform that fully fit in such an approach that places human rights at the center. These pathways are: 1, put people's health and safety first. 2, ensure access to essential medicines and pain control. 3, end the criminalization and incarceration of people who use drugs. 4, refocus enforcement responses to drug trafficking and organized crime. And 5, regulate drug markets to put governments in control. Considering that the right to health serves as the basis of our first 2 priorities, namely to put the health of people and communities first, and to ensure universal access to medicines under international control, the Global Commission stresses that governments need to establish clear plans and timelines to remove the domestic and international obstacles to the provision of essential medicines under international control. The Global Commission also recommends that to overcome the global crisis of avoidable pain, UN drug control bodies and states must recognize that drug policies at both national and international levels are imbalanced, with the current emphasis on preventing the diversion of controlled substances, which holds primacy over ensuring their access for medical use. We also believe that a high priority must be given to the treatment of physical and mental pain by ensuring access to controlled medicines, including opioids, for pain relief, palliative care, anesthesia, dependency, and all other forms of suffering, especially those that are on the World Health Organization's model list of essential medicines. It is equally important to expand the spectrum of treatment for opioid dependence while respecting human dignity and offering the possibility of prescription of controlled medicines such as methadone and buprenorphine or diamorphine. While the International Narcotics Control Board must take more assertive steps in working with countries that consistently lack adequate access to controlled medicines, ensuring they provide evidence-based estimates to document their needs, governments and UN drug control bodies should also review the 1961 and 1971 drug convention schedules in light of scientific evidence and prioritize exploring the medical benefits of controlled substances based on World Health Organization's Expert Committee on Drug Dependence recommendations. With an increasing number of states and UN bodies drawing attention to the lack of access to controlled medicines, we are reaching a critical juncture. The Global Commission on Drug Policy encourages all stakeholders to join forces on tackling inequitable access to controlled medicines. And then, of course, we are aware on the 23rd of June this year, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement calling for an end to the war on drugs, and part of that statement reads as follows: globally, drug control has had massive costs for the dignity, humanity, and freedom of people of African descent, with reports showing that people of African descent face disproportionate and unjust law enforcement interventions, arrests, and incarceration for drug-related offenses. In various countries, the war on drugs has been more effective as a system of racial control than as a tool to reduce drug markets. Policing interventions based on racial profiling remain widespread, whilst access to evidence-based treatment and harm reduction for people of African descent remains critically low, close quote. As members of the Eastern and Southern Africa Commission on Drugs, we believe that reshaping our little part of the world for human dignity goes hand in hand with better policies that use compassion and science as navigators through hardship, and that reduce and not produce harm in the process. As you gather here together this week, I wish that you will do so with the same energy and hope I've seen in the eyes of civil society activists from whom we have had the opportunity and privilege to learn so much. The work you are doing and the subjects that you are discussing are important. Important not just for their content, but for what they can do to shape policy in line with the theme and objectives of this gathering. In closing, I want to wish every one of you, as participants in this Africa Policy Week, a productive and successful week ahead. And I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.